Hello, welcome to our webinar on the protein trend, demand, prices, and implications, brought to you by CFAIR. That's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the CFAIR Program Chair. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar, and welcome everyone. Next slide. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I'd like to provide some background on today's topic. Today, we'll have leading scholars for our webinar who are exploring the drivers and consequences behind the growing focus on protein consumption. Through evidence-based presentations and a moderated Q&A session, we'll examine key supply chain dynamics from production to consumer demand and their implications for producers and consumers. Next slide. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work. We'll start with Miguel Gomez. Miguel is the Robert J. Tobin Professor of Food Marketing at Cornell University's Dyson School and Faculty Director of the Food Industry Management Program. He holds an MS and PhD in Applied Economics from the University of Illinois, and his research centers on food value chain competitiveness, sustainability, and market performance from farm to consumer, with additional work on small shareholder participation and food system sustainability in Latin America. Justin Vina is an assistant professor in the Morrison School of Agribusiness at Arizona State University, a position he's held since August 2024. He earned his PhD in agricultural economics from Kansas State University. Justin's research focuses on food demand, consumer behavior, and the intersection of health, fitness, and agricultural markets, with a particular emphasis on protein consumption and emerging drivers such as GLP-1 use. He teaches courses in agribusiness and food systems with a focus on developing students' professional and communication skills, along with engagement with the local agricultural community. Maria Calazondoganis is an assistant professor of agricultural and consumer economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her work centers on what we eat and why we eat it. Specifically, her research is focused on the impacts of U.S. food policy and food marketing in decision-making and the implications for food safety, health, and nutrition. Before I hand things over to our panelists, I'd like to remind you that you can submit questions for the speakers in the chat box at any time. We'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentations where our panelists will address your questions. Now I'll hand the webinar over to our panelists, and I believe we're starting with Miguel. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you, Jane, and it's an honor to be here and have this opportunity to present. I'm going to start the webinar with sharing with you a few supply chain considerations that are relevant to the protein trend and transformation of the food supply chains for sustainability. Next, please. So this is inspired by a recent paper my colleague Daishin Lee and I published in the Journal of Supply Chain Management, in which we think about what are the transformation forces that are happening in the food supply chain to improve sustainability in economic, environmental, and social dimensions. So I will share with you some insights in the context of protein demand. Next, please. So the first question is why protein demand matters now. First, as my colleagues are going to talk later, explaining that the protein consumption is rising, and that's across animal, plant-based, and hybrid categories. At the same time, this increased demand intersects with certain pressures on sustainability pressures on land, water, labor, energy, and all the inputs that are required along the supply chain. In the left diagram, you see that what is interesting is that if you look at any category of food and agriculture, meat is a bright spot from the point of view of the producers. Retail prices are high, the value is high, and when you look at the ag production, it's one of the sectors in which growers are making good margins as opposed to many other farm activities. Yeah. So the key question is, can current supply chains meet long-term protein needs sustainably? And I will start by recognizing that modern supply chains in this country have made tremendous progress in making protein affordable and accessible. And yet there are a few concerns regarding the long-term sustainability. Next, please. So first, I want to put in the context about why do we talk about supply chain? Because value-added activities beyond the farm gate are extremely important, and they vary according to the product. So in the left, in the diagram, I am sharing with you the food at home farm shares. Then say, for example, in the beef, the second category, beef production, the farm share of the retail value is about 50%, and is lower for poultry, about 45%, and for pork, the main sources of animal protein, is about 30%. And if you think about processed plant-based products, is much lower. So whatever happens along the supply chain in processing, retailing, transport, food service, and supermarkets matter to the whole supply chain and to our producers. Next one, please. And here I'm just showing a diagram to illustrate the beef cattle supply chain work that we have done recently in the Northeast. I'm going to share a few insights of our studies on this. But you have production, but you have slaughter, processing, customers, retailing, etc. So much of the value is added beyond the farm. Next, please. So few words about the mainstream protein supply chain. Animal-based, which is predominant in this country, is dominated by large-scale, generally monoculture and concentrated animal feeding operations. The benefits of these huge economies of scale, driving efficiency and low marginal cost. I always say that in the United States, we have the privilege and the benefit of having very cheap food, in part because our food system is relatively concentrated and focusing on efficiencies. When we think about the supply chain, the main characteristic is consolidation of processors and retailers. In the diagram, we see the production control, the share of the largest 4 corporations in the main animal products, poultry, pork, and beef, 60%, 70%, and 80 to 85% respectively. So it's a sector that is highly concentrated, relies heavily on specialized assets and input-intensive production. Next slide, please. So this system that is predominant has, again, produced many benefits, particularly to consumers, but it has some emerging pressures of the current model. So among them, soil degradation, water scarcity. There is consensus that more and more our resources are scarce, and fertilizer dependence raise long-run costs. There are environmental externalities that have been increasingly recognized by society, policymakers, and by the private sectors, including consumers. At the same time, the downstream part of the supply chain, consumers, retailers, are demanding improved sustainability performance and are open to differentiated products. My colleagues are going to talk about that later. And in addition, inputs such as water, fertile soil, and fossil fuels are becoming more scarce and more expensive. So those are the emerging pressures. Next one, please. So as a result, there is growing interest in trying to understand within the protein supply chain, what are emerging alternative supply chains. One that we have been working for a few years is focusing on grass-fed beef production, and in particular in regions dominated in cool climate regions like New England, New York, but it's also relevant for many other cool climate regions in the US. And we have done several supply chain analysis. This is the most recent paper. And the bottom line here is that if you look at the cost of production and look at the availability of land for grazing in the Northeast and other regions in the US, and if you consider the price premiums that consumers are willing to pay for grass-fed beef, makes the US production very competitive with respect to imported grass-fed beef, which is mostly coming from Australia in this moment, and it is competitive to the mainstream supply chain that we just mentioned. So these are emerging supply chains that are gaining attention in our our sector and the market for animal protein. Next one. And more on my extension side, and particular here in the Northeast, we start to see a growing interest on the intersections between the dairy supply chains, which are having a hard time at this moment in our region, in New York, New England, and the meat supply chain. For example, the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, and we are evaluating the economics, recognize that that the old retired cows, if you put them grazing, and there is research going on this, the meat resulting from those cows are considered of excellent quality, are different to what we have in the standards that USDA sets. But in other regions, like in Europe, the meat from these cows, retired cows that are grazed to finish, they are the high premium meat, helping producers diversify incomes. Dairy producers also participate in the specialized meat market sector with very good returns to investments. So this is a quote. This is a dairy cow grazing delicious cover crops in the Rockefeller Preserve where the Stone Barns work, but Stone Barn isn't making milk. These girls are retired from their dairy days to be a producer of high quality meat when they are slaughtered. The next one, please. So these are examples of ways in which this is happening. And on the other, of course, is the growing interest for plant-based protein products, which is encouraging private and public investment in infrastructure to focus on products like beans, peas, and here, for example, is a work being done on, I'm showing you the projections on the growth, 14% CAGR is an amazing growth for the demand. And you see, for example, in the right-hand side, the supply chain and the type of actors that are investing and making this supply chain viable. Next one, please. And I'm about to finish here. So with the final considerations here is that we need to recognize that the mainstream protein supply chains have contributed tremendously to expand consumption and to make protein affordable to consumers, focusing on efficiencies, economies of scale. Regenerative agriculture and other practices that are implied in the cases I discussed before, this is generating demand for differentiated protein products, and they require different supply chain configurations to avoid misalignment. So the third point is that policy has a role to play here to create the appropriate incentive for investments in infrastructure to support emerging ways in which protein is reaching the consumer's table. And an expanding protein market requires balance between economic, environmental, and social outcomes for success. Thank you for your attention. And I think I am on time, Jane.
Yeah, you exactly on time. Thank you very much, Miguel. Sounds like there's some good news in there for farmers and consumers. I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about that later. Next, we're going to hear from Justin. Welcome, Justin.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today, and thank you, Jane, for coordinating what is really a very timely and important discussion on current protein trends. My role today is going to be to discuss more traditional meat products and some developments we've been seeing kind of in the demand space the last few years. So if you could advance the slide, please. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so a quick background on trends we've been seeing the last few years. Since COVID-19, so since the pandemic, we've observed a pretty drastic increase in prices of beef, pork, and poultry products in the US. Uh, so January 19 to January 26, we saw a 67% increase in the wholesale beef cutout, 35% increase in the pork cutout, and a 22% increase in the broiler national composite. That's all due to various factors, COVID-19 related supply side disruptions, increased fertilizer and feed cost. We had some drought and herd liquidation on the beef side, and then some regulatory issues on the pork side. But at the same time, so over the same, 6 years, we've actually seen pretty steady per capita disappearance. So disappearance here is our kind of proxy for consumption. So steady consumption, rapidly increasing prices, that's kind of telling us that over the last 6 or so years, we've seen an increase in domestic meat demand. So myself and my colleagues have been asking ourselves, what's causing this increase in demand? So today I'm going to talk about two specific examples that we've been studying. So if I could have the slides advanced. Thank you. Okay, so the first one is current societal exercise and fitness trends. We saw from 2019 to 2024 an 11.4% increase in the number of US adults that are participating in sports and exercise. That has translated into 77, so now 77 million adults in the country are currently members of either gyms or fitness studios. And that number, so that's a 2024 number, that's up 5.6% from 2023. And that's actually up 5.5% from 2022. Okay, so why does that matter in today's discussion? It is actually pretty commonly recommended that individuals who are engaged in physical exercise pursuits that they consume more protein than people who are not engaged in those pursuits, and actually at a level of up to 2.5 times higher than the recommended dietary allowance. So recommended to eat quite a bit more protein. And then that relationship between protein consumption and exercise and fitness trends, it's all over social media, it's all over news media. If you've picked up your phone anytime in the last 4 or 5 years, I'm sure you've seen something. And if we could move on to the next slide. Okay, thank you. And then the second example here, even more recent than the exercise trends, is GLP-1 adoption, which I'm sure you're all familiar with at this point, the weight loss medications. Our last estimate, so fall 2025, was that 12% of US adults are currently using some type of GLP-1 medication, either to treat diabetes or to manage body weight. And why this is important to today's discussion is that these GLP-1 users are recommended to consume lean protein sources like seafood or chicken, and also eggs and dairy products. And why that's the case is because those kinds of protein dense foods, well, they're protein dense, they're nutrient dense. Those nutrients are coming in smaller volumes of food to match GLP-1 users' reduced appetites. And then these high protein diets actually help individuals to retain more muscle mass while they're losing body weight. And then that last bullet point, we're likely to see GLP-1 adoption continue to increase in the next couple years. At the tail end of 2025, so right before Christmas, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services announced a couple new programs to really improve access to GLP-1 medications for individuals who are using Medicare and Medicaid, and specifically improve access for the purpose of weight management. So we'll see how this adoption continues in the future. And then again, this relationship between GLP-1 use and protein consumption, it's all over news media, it's all over social media. Okay, if we could move on. Thank you. Okay, so myself and my colleagues, we've been asking ourselves, can these behaviors like physical exercise, like these decisions to use GLP-1 medications, can they explain steady domestic meat consumption despite rising prices? So are they actually acting as demand drivers? So do these behaviors, does GLP-1 use, is it impacting willingness to pay for meat protein, price sensitivity, substitution patterns between products? And to assess all of that, how would we go about measuring these things? So if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we've kind of been trying to answer those questions using publicly available survey data from the Meat Demand Monitor. So very briefly, the Meat Demand Monitor is an online consumer survey. It goes out every month. It's administered out of K-State Research and Extension, and it's funded by both the beef and pork checkoff programs. And in this Meat Demand Monitor survey instrument, or in the survey, we have a few different choice experiments that I leverage to measure meat demand. We also have pretty rich details on respondents' sociodemographic information or characteristics, and importantly, information on their exercise habits and their GLP-1 use. And if we could move on. Thank you. So I'm gonna skip all the methods. We have a series of papers out now if you're interested. What we're finding at a very high level anyway is pretty substantial heterogeneity in retail and food service meat demand across three factors. So across strength-based exercise habits, across aerobic exercise habits, and across GLP-1 use. And the takeaway here is individuals who are participating in these exercise pursuits or who are using GLP-1 medications have higher demand for meat products than individuals who are not exercising or individuals who are not using GLP-1 medications. So higher demand, meaning they have higher willingness to pay for any given quantity of these meat products. And then the second takeaway is this elevated meat demand. So this higher willingness to pay among the physically active and among GLP-1 users, it's not completely explained by income and other consumer traits like sex or age or where you live. Some portion of this is actually attributable to the exercise habits themselves or to GLP-1 use itself. Okay, and if we could move on. Thank you. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that aggregate demand is strengthening in the US. So aggregate meat demand is strengthening, but it's also fragmenting. So we have these exercise behaviors, we have GLP-1 use, they're changing food preferences, they're yielding higher valuations for protein. It's all strengthening underlying demand. But in addition to that, we also now have fewer what I call on the fence consumers of protein, meaning we have a segment of the population that has higher valuations. We have fewer consumers making decisions on the margin. So fewer consumers making decisions to enter into or exit out of the market due to small price fluctuations. And that means as a whole, so in aggregate, we are now less price sensitive than we have been in the past. And that's helping to explain these recent observations of steady consumption despite rising prices. And I see Jane, so we're going to go on to the last slide. Thank you very much. So a quick thank you to my colleagues that have been working on those studies with me. Dr. Glenn Tonser out of Kansas State, Dr. Timothy Richards, he's at Arizona State with me. And then I'd also like to thank the U.S. Beef and Pork Checkoff programs for funding the Meat Demand Monitor and really enabling this work. So with that, I am done, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Justin. Before we move on to our last presentation, which is, this was fascinating, Justin. Keep those questions coming in, audience, so that we can have a lively discussion at the end. Our last presenter is Maria, and she's going to talk about labeling and added protein. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about added protein and piggybacking off of what we just talked about with meat. So go ahead and progress the slides. Okay, so for us to all be on the same page, added protein is not the same thing as meat protein that we just discussed. Added protein tends to be things like whey protein or pea protein or soy protein being added to products that some have protein naturally in them and some are lacking in protein. Along with what you just heard from both of our previous panelists, consumer demand for protein is increasing, and this extends to added protein products. But what I think is particularly interesting about the added protein phenomenon is that we have this one side phenomenon that you've heard about today, which is increased demand for protein, but you also have this sort of other phenomenon happening at the same time, where people are wanting more natural products, where people are wanting clean labels, where people are looking for shorter ingredient labels, right? And there's tension between these two sometimes within the added protein. So we've heard active debates around should protein bars be considered an ultra processed food? Should protein shakes be considered an ultra processed food, right? So that it's bringing up tension between these two phenomena. The other thing that I'll highlight is that we are seeing particular interest in added protein within indulgent flavors. So for example, you can see the number of people that are Googling things like protein desserts has skyrocketed over the last few years. We can go ahead and progress to the next slide. Okay, so I'm not calling anybody out, but probably somebody on the call, I'm looking at all of you, had one of these products for breakfast. Proteinification, it's an industry term that's saying we're adding protein to a lot of different types of products. So you're going to see a lot of different things here. A lot of these are snacks or breakfast foods. Those are areas where we're seeing this commonly added. But we're also seeing it added to things like yogurt and cottage cheese that are already naturally high in protein. Yeah, you can progress to the next slide. So what do we know about products that are labeled with protein or high in protein, added protein? We don't know a lot, but there is a little bit of literature. It's mostly looking at protein bars and then a little bit of protein cereal. And basically the gist of what we've learned so far is that labeling something with a protein label increases consumers' perception of healthfulness. So if they see that protein label, they think the product is slightly more healthy. It also decreases their perception of tastiness and naturalness. Again, this isn't a limited set of products that it's been studied, but that's what has been found so far. And then there's a little bit of evidence that says, this might motivate at least some consumers to make a choice, especially when we ask people which they prefer. They'll say, the added protein product. Next slide, please. So this leads me to the paper that I'm going to talk about today. So this is joint work with Daeun Kim, who's a PhD student here, and Brenna Ellison, who's a professor at Purdue. And we wanted to sort of understand how does demand vary across, heterogeneous situations here. So we looked at two different products, yogurt, which is naturally high in protein, and then pancake mix, which is not. We looked at different flavors of both, so a sweetened version and an unsweetened, plain version of each of those products. And then we were looking at demand across consumer segments. So this was with an online survey of 1,000 US adult consumers recruited to match the US population in terms of a bunch of different demographic characteristics. And you can progress. So what do we find on average? We find on average that people are more in favor of added protein within yogurt. We saw an average of a 13.6% increase in willingness to pay on that. That was for the unflavored version. For pancake mix, we didn't on average see an effect. And for the unflavored version, again, there was a lot of heterogeneity, so no average effect. We echo what the literature has shown there, that perceptions of naturalness for unflavored yogurt went down when you added the label. Perceptions of healthfulness for flavored yogurt went up, and then perceptions of taste for flavored pancake mix went down. Next. So breaking it down a little bit more, we did look at classes of consumers to try to understand heterogeneity across groups. So there's one group of consumers that accounted for about 45% of our respondents, and they were strongly in favor of added protein in yogurt, and they were in favor of it both in unflavored and in flavored versions, with a slightly higher premium for it in flavored versions. So while there wasn't an average impact across the whole group, within this segment of people who do like added protein within yogurt, there's this 33.7% increase premium on flavored yogurt. And then who is more likely to be in this group? Some things that you might expect, right? Do they have previous experience with an added protein product? Do they think protein is an important part of their diet? But they were also more likely to be young, be female, and then have low or moderate incomes. The income piece is really interesting here. Future research could look at, are people substituting across added protein products versus more expensive meat products. Next slide. On the pancake mix side, there was no group that wanted added protein in unflavored pancake mix. And I do feel like part of this is the taste factor. But there was a large group, about 47.2%, that preferred added protein in flavored pancake mix. This premium was smaller than that in yogurt. It was about 9%, but still a substantial premium. And then who was more likely to be in this group? The same attributes as we said before with the previous group in yogurt. So, they prefer that they have utilized an added protein product before, and they place importance of protein in their diet. They're younger, but this group was more likely to be male. Similarly, they were likely to have lower incomes, but then really interestingly, they were also less likely to exercise. So different from sort of the increased demand from exercise for meat products, we see sort of a substitution effect here where, potentially, this makes you feel healthier or, something to that respect. It's also worth noting that while nobody was demanding discounts for protein in yogurt, there are some groups that are so opposed to added protein in pancake mix that they demand a discount. Next slide, please. We also asked respondents if they had any concerns about added protein to try to get at that tension between those two trends that we talked about at the beginning. And about 20% said that they had some concerns. And we had this open text box where people could respond and say what concerns they had. And I've added a few examples here of what people said and a few categories. So one category was this idea of unnatural, right? I don't want something else extra added. I'm concerned about the chemical processes involved in, the whey, or I don't trust additives. There's a lot of this sort of, I'm not sure what you're adding into my product, I'm concerned. The second sort of category I've highlighted here is that there's lack of clarity around either the quality of the added protein or the source of the added protein. So there were some people saying, oh, it needs to be real protein, or, I want to know, is it whey versus soy? Wanting more information there. There also were comments about, okay, it has added protein, but, maybe it's high in sugar or maybe it's high in salt, carbohydrates. There was also sort of concern on that side. And then finally, there was also a group that said, I already have too much protein in my diet, or protein isn't necessary for my health, or, something like that. Next slide. So, added protein demand is on the rise, and one of the things that we find in our study that I think is important to underscore is that our results would say that demand for added protein is not homogeneous across products, across flavors, or across consumer segments. There's a lot of heterogeneity here, and how consumers are going to respond is going to be different. We also build on the health halo literature, where we show that people are thinking that the label does indicate that the product is healthier, but that there are also these sort of questions about naturalness and flavor. The other thing I'll highlight here is that we heard that GLP-1 drugs are affecting demand. We heard that exercise is affecting demand. The other thing I'll underscore here, especially for folks that are interested in policy, is we're seeing an increased emphasis on protein via federal recommendations, so the dietary guidelines for Americans that just came out. And I lead something called the Gardner Food and Ag Policy Survey at the University of Illinois, which is a joint effort with Purdue, where we try to understand public perceptions of issues in the food system. And overwhelmingly, when we recently asked about the dietary guidelines, people said that prioritizing protein foods at every meal was really important for their health and was something that they wanted to be doing. So last slide. Feel free to keep talking and ask questions even beyond the Q&A session. So you can send me an email or chat with me on LinkedIn.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all of our panelists.